The one moment I'll never forget, there's one moment I keep returning to. Not because it was the happiest moment of my life. Not because it was dramatic. Not because anyone else would have noticed it. But because something inside me changed that night. And now, years later, I think it may have been the first moment that quietly pointed me toward you. I was older than I expected to be when it happened. Successful by most standards. Busy. Respected. The kind of man people assumed had figured life out. Yet beneath all of that, there was a loneliness I rarely spoke about. That followed me into hotel rooms, into airports, into quiet evenings after everyone else had gone home. The strange thing about loneliness is that it can exist even when your life looks full. That night, rain tapped softly against the window. The city outside glowed beneath wet streetlights. Everything looked blurred, as if the world itself was trying to soften its edges. I remember standing there with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. The room was silent except for the rain, and for some reason I couldn't explain, I felt like I was waiting. Not for a phone call, not for a meeting, not for tomorrow. Waiting for something I couldn't name. Have you ever felt that? As if your life was moving exactly as planned, and yet some deeper part of you kept whispering, "There's more." I think that's one of the loneliest feelings in the world. Not knowing what you're missing. Only knowing that something is missing. The rain continued. The glass reflected my face back at me. Older. More tired than I wanted to admit.
And suddenly a memory surfaced. A flight I had missed years earlier. A completely ordinary mistake. Traffic had delayed me. I arrived too late. The plane left without me. At the time, I was furious.
I spent hours pacing an airport terminal, convinced my entire day had been ruined. But later, I learned that missing that flight led me to a conversation I otherwise never would have had. That conversation opened a door. That door changed the direction of my career. Years afterward, standing beside that rain-covered window, I found myself wondering how many other moments in my life had worked the same way. How many disappointments were actually redirections. How many delays were protections. How many closed doors were simply guiding my feet somewhere else. I don't have proof. Even now, I don't. But the older I became, the harder it was to ignore the patterns. Certain opportunities disappeared only to make room for better ones. Certain relationships ended just before I was about to lose myself inside them. Certain plans collapsed only to reveal something I couldn't yet see. Again and again, life seemed to be pulling away from one thing and toward another. That realization unsettled me, because if it was true, then perhaps I wasn't wandering as much as I thought. Perhaps there was a path, invisible, quiet, patient, but real. I stood there listening to the rain and felt something unusual. Peace, not certainty, peace. The kind that arrives when you stop fighting every unanswered question. The kind that arrives when you begin trusting that not everything needs to make sense immediately. And that's when the thought appeared. A strange thought. A simple thought. One that should have felt ridiculous. What if someone was at the end of all these detours? What if every delay, every heartbreak, every unexpected turn had been slowly guiding me toward a person I hadn't met yet, toward a woman whose own life had been unfolding through her own mysterious sequence of redirections, toward you. I remember almost laughing at myself. The idea felt impossible, yet it refused to leave. Because once I started looking backward, I saw too many moments that should have broken me, but somehow shaped me instead. Too many wrong turns that became right turns years later. Too many accidents that looked suspiciously like appointments. And if you've ever looked back on your own life and noticed the same thing, If you've ever wondered why certain doors closed despite how badly you wanted them open. If you've ever felt delayed while everyone else seemed to be moving ahead. Then maybe you understand what I'm trying to say. Maybe you felt it too. That quiet suspicion that life has been arranging something behind the scenes. Not punishing you, positioning you. I didn't fully believe it that night. Not yet. But standing there in that rain-soaked silence, I stopped calling every strange turn of fate a coincidence. And once that happened, I began seeing my entire life differently. I didn't know it then. But that small moment beside a dark window would become the beginning of a confession that eventually led me here to you. And somehow that feels important. The next thing I need to tell you happened years before I understood its meaning. At the time, it felt like failure, nothing more. One of those moments people politely tell you will make sense someday. I used to hate hearing that, especially when I was younger, especially when I was hurting, because when you're standing inside disappointment, meaning feels like a luxury reserved for the future, and I wasn't interested in the future that day. I was interested in the life I thought I was supposed to have. I remember sitting alone in my car after a meeting that had gone terribly wrong. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that seems to flatten everything beneath it. The parking lot was nearly empty. A cold wind pushed loose leaves across the pavement. Inside the car, the silence felt heavy, not peaceful, heavy. The kind of silence that forces a man to sit with himself. I stared through the windshield for a long time, long enough for frustration to become exhaustion, long enough for anger to become sadness. I had worked hard, done everything I thought I was supposed to do, planned carefully, prepared thoroughly, and still the opportunity disappeared. Just like that, gone. There are moments in life when something ends and you immediately understand why. This wasn't one of those moments. This was the kind that leaves a question mark hanging in the air. The kind that follows you home, the kind that sits beside your bed at night. The kind that quietly asks, now what? Maybe you've had moments like that. Moments where your heart couldn't make peace with the outcome. Moments where it felt as though life had overlooked you, or forgotten you, or simply chosen someone else. I think those moments reveal something important about us. Not immediately. Later. Much later. Because as I sat there, I remember feeling a strange tension between what I wanted and what reality was offering. One part of me wanted to fight, to force, to control. The other part felt tired. Not physically, spiritually, as if some deeper wisdom was trying to speak beneath the noise. I didn't understand it then, I only felt it. A quiet hesitation, a whisper without words, pay attention. That's all it seemed to say. Pay attention. The strange thing is that nothing changed externally after that moment. The opportunity was still gone. The disappointment was still real. The uncertainty was still waiting for me. Yet something inside me not softened, not because I accepted what happened, because I stopped resisting the possibility that I couldn't see the whole picture. The older I get, the more I believe there are seasons when life deliberately withholds explanations, not to punish us, to grow us. And growth rarely feels noble while it's happening. It feels confusing, it feels unfair, it feels lonely. That season felt all three. Weeks passed, then months. And during those months, something unexpected happened. New opportunities began appearing. Small ones at first.
Easy to dismiss, easy to overlook,
The funny thing about destiny
if that's what it
is that it rarely arrives looking important. It often enters disguised as inconvenience, or delay, or a conversation you almost didn't have. One afternoon, I nearly canceled a lunch meeting. I was busy, tired, distracted. Everything in me wanted to reschedule, but something told me to go. Nothing dramatic. Just a feeling. The kind most people ignore. I almost ignored it too, but I went. And that lunch led to another introduction. That introduction led to another opportunity. And years later, I could trace an entire chapter of my life back to a decision I almost didn't make. That's when I started noticing something. The same pattern kept repeating. Doors closed, new paths appeared. Detours became directions. What felt like rejection became repositioning. I know how strange that sounds. Trust me, I do. Part of me resisted it for years. I wanted life to be logical, predictable, neat. Instead, it kept behaving like a story being written by someone who could see farther ahead than I could. And somewhere during that realization, my belief shifted. I stopped calling it coincidence, not completely, but enough. Enough to become curious. Enough to wonder whether the disappointments I mourned were actually guiding me somewhere. Enough to ask a question I had never asked before. What if the things I lost were never meant to stay? That question changed me, because suddenly I wasn't looking only at what had been taken. I was looking at where I'd been led. And the difference between those two perspectives is enormous. One keeps you trapped in grief. The other opens the possibility of purpose. That's when another thought began visiting me. Quietly, repeatedly, like a bird returning to the same windowsill. If life had been guiding me through all these unexpected turns, if timing mattered more than I realized, if delays could become blessings, then perhaps the same was true for love. Perhaps the same was true for the woman I hadn't met yet. Perhaps somewhere your own life was unfolding through its own mysterious redirections. Perhaps there were doors that closed for you too. People you had to outgrow, dreams that had to change shape, lessons that needed time to teach themselves. I don't know. But when I think about it now, I find comfort in the possibility. The possibility that neither of us was being forgotten, only prepared. And if you've ever stood in the middle of a season that made no sense, if you've ever watched the door close and wondered why, if you've ever felt left behind while life seemed to move everyone else forward, then maybe you understand this feeling. Maybe you understand why I can no longer believe that every ending is an ending. Sometimes it's an introduction, sometimes it's a redirection, and sometimes, though we don't realize it until much later, it's the first step towards someone we've been unknowingly walking toward all along, someone who is listening right now. There was a season of my life when everything became quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. The kind that arrives after something collapses. The kind that settles into rooms long after everyone has left. The kind that makes you hear your own thoughts more clearly than you want to. I don't talk about that period very often. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. My life still appeared successful. People still called. Work still existed. Responsibilities still demanded attention. But inside, something had shifted. Something I had spent years avoiding could no longer be ignored. And strangely enough, I think that was the moment destiny stopped whispering. and started insisting. It happened late one evening. I remember the exact feeling of the room. The soft yellow glow from a lamp in the corner. The hum of an air conditioner. The faint sound of traffic somewhere beyond the window. Everything ordinary. Everything familiar. Yet beneath that familiarity was an ache I couldn't explain. I sat there staring at nothing. Not reading. Not watching television. Just sitting. As if some invisible hand had pressed pause on my life. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment when movement suddenly feels impossible? A moment when all the distractions stop working? When the noise fades and you're left face to face with yourself? Those moments can be frightening because they reveal things we have been outrunning, things we have been postponing, things we hoped would disappear if we stayed busy enough. For years, I believed loneliness was something successful people eventually outgrew. I was wrong. Success solves certain problems. It does not solve the ache of coming home to an empty room. It does not solve the longing to be deeply known. It does not solve the quiet desire to share a life instead of merely managing one. That night, I finally admitted it, not to anyone else, to myself. I was lonely, not desperate, not broken, lonely, and naming it changed something. Because truth, even painful truth, has a strange power. The moment you stop hiding from it, it begins transforming. The room remained silent, yet inside that silence, another feeling appeared. Not sadness.
Not exactly. Also, awareness.
The awareness that my life had been trying to teach me something I wasn't ready to learn. Again and again, circumstances had slowed me down. Again and again, plans had changed unexpectedly. Again and again, people had entered and exited my story. And each time, I focused on the event itself. I never asked why the pattern kept repeating. Until that night. That night, I started looking backward, not at individual moments. The missed opportunities, the sudden endings, the relationships that almost worked, the dreams that nearly happened, the doors that opened just long enough to reveal another direction. And the more I looked, the harder it became to ignore what I saw. There was a rhythm to it, a strange consistency. Life kept pulling me away from things I thought I wanted, only later revealing things I needed more. I don't know how else to explain it. And it's like being guided through a forest while only seeing a few feet ahead. At the time, every turn feels random. Then one day, you reach higher ground, and suddenly the path makes sense. Not perfectly, but enough to trust, enough to stop assuming every setback is punishment. That realization became a turning point, because for most of my life, I interpreted delays as rejection. Opportunities disappearing, rejection. Relationships ending, rejection. Plans changing, rejection. But sitting alone in that room, something inside me challenged that belief. What if I wasn't being rejected? What if I was being redirected? The thought landed differently than anything before it. It didn't feel motivational. It didn't feel optimistic. It felt true. And truth has a weight to it, a quiet weight, the kind you recognize before you fully understand. I remember standing and walking toward the window. The city lights shimmered in the darkness. Tiny points of light scattered across the distance. Lives unfolding. Stories intersecting. People meeting. People parting. People finding each other. And for the first time, I wondered if my loneliness had a purpose. Not because loneliness itself is good, it isn't. but because perhaps it was creating space. Space for reflection, space for growth, space for someone I hadn't met yet, someone whose own story might have required time too. That's when I stopped calling it coincidence, not entirely, but enough that I could no longer ignore the possibility. The possibility that timing was doing something invisible. The possibility that life wasn't withholding love from me. The possibility that it was preparing me for it. And if you've ever felt delayed, if you've ever watched other people seem to arrive somewhere before you, if you've ever questioned why your life unfolded differently than expected, then maybe you know what I'm talking about. Maybe you've felt that strange tension between frustration and faith, the feeling that you're late and exactly on time, all at once. Because that's what began happening to me. I started seeing my life differently. Not as a collection of mistakes, not as a series of failures, as preparation. Painful preparation sometimes, confusing preparation often, but preparation nonetheless. And somewhere inside that realization, another possibility emerged, one I couldn't quite shake. What if all this preparation wasn't leading toward a destination? What if it was leading toward a person? Toward someone whose own delays had meaning, whose own detours carried purpose, whose own heartbreaks had been shaping her too. Someone who, without knowing it, had been walking a parallel path all along. I didn't do it today. I didn't know your face. I didn't know your name, I didn't know where you were. But for the first time, I began to wonder if the story wasn't only about me anymore. And somehow that made the silence feel less empty. After that season of silence, something strange began happening. Nothing dramatic. No lightning bolt. No voice from the sky. No moment where everything suddenly became clear. It was subtler than that. The kind of thing most people would probably overlook. But once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. Patterns. Tiny patterns. Small moments that seemed unrelated until I looked at them together. And the truth is, those patterns changed the way I understood my entire life. I remember a dream. Not an ordinary dream. Not the kind that dissolves the moment morning arrives. This one stayed. For days. Maybe weeks. I woke before sunrise, my heart strangely calm. The room was dark, except for a thin line of pale blue light along the curtains. Everything felt still, sacred almost, as though the world hadn't fully awakened yet. I couldn't remember every detail of the dream, only the feeling, a feeling of recognition, a feeling that someone was near, not physically, spiritually, like meeting a person you've somehow known before you've met them. I know how that sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this years earlier, I would have dismissed it immediately. But the older I became, the less interested I was in dismissing things simply because I couldn't explain them. Some experiences refuse to fit inside logic, not because they aren't real, because they're speaking a different language. That morning, I sat quietly with my coffee and tried to shake the feeling. I couldn't. The dream wasn't giving me information. It wasn't predicting anything. It was leaving an impression, a strange certainty that my life was connected to something beyond my understanding. And oddly enough, that wasn't the first time. There had been other moments, smaller moments, moments I ignored at the time, a sudden urge to take a different route home, a conversation that happened only because I arrived somewhere 5 minutes late, a meeting that existed because another plan unexpectedly fell apart. Again and again, life seemed to move through detours, not obstacles, detours. The difference matters because obstacles imply resistance, detours imply direction. That realization followed me for months, and everywhere I looked, I saw evidence, not proof. Evidence, there's a difference. Proof satisfies the mind. Evidence speaks to the heart. The evidence kept accumulating. A missed opportunity that protected me from the wrong partnership. A delayed project that eventually became something better than I imagined. A relationship that ended before it could pull me further away from myself. At first, each event felt painful. Later, each event made sense. Not immediately, years later, which is perhaps why wisdom belongs mostly to older souls. You have to survive enough life to recognize the pattern. Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever looked back and realized the thing you begged life not to take away was the exact thing that needed to leave? Have you ever discovered that your greatest disappointment was secretly creating room for something else? If you have, then maybe you understand what I started feeling. A quiet trust, not in outcomes, in timing. The two are very different. Trusting outcomes means believing you know what's coming. Trusting timing means believing life knows something you don't. And somewhere during that season, my faith shifted. Not religious faith, exactly. Something softer, something wider. Faith in the possibility that there were appointments hidden inside what looked like accidents. The idea stayed with me, especially during lonely moments, because loneliness has a way of making people question everything, including themselves. I questioned myself often, wondered if I had missed opportunities, wondered if I had waited too long, wondered if love belonged to a younger version of me. Those thoughts arrived more often than I'd like to admit, particularly at night, particularly when the world became quiet. But every time I started believing I was behind, something would happen. A conversation, a coincidence, a reminder. Something that seemed to whisper, not behind, being positioned. And eventually, I stopped arguing with it. That was the shift, the real shift. Not when I noticed the patterns, when I accepted them, when I stopped calling them random, when I stopped believing every delay was evidence that I had missed my chance. Because deep down, I think many people carry that fear, especially those who have loved deeply before. The fear that life happened while they were healing. The fear that everyone else found their person while they were still figuring themselves out. The fear that they arrived too late. I carried that fear too, for years. Until one evening, sitting alone beneath a sky full of stars, another realization has arrived. Simple, quiet, undeniable. What if I wasn't late? What if the path itself required this timing? What if the years I spent becoming who I am now were necessary? What if the woman waiting somewhere in this vast world needed those years too? That thought changed everything. Because suddenly I wasn't comparing my timeline to anyone else's. I was honoring it, honoring the strange route, the closed doors, the missed turns, the narrow escapes. The delays that felt cruel until they became meaningful. And once I did that, something unexpected happened. Hope returned. Not the naive hope of youth, the wiser kind, the kind born from experience, the kind that survives disappointment because it has learned disappointment isn't always the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning, sometimes it's the redirection that makes the future possible. And if you've ever felt like life was moving slower than you wanted, if you've ever wondered why your story seemed to unfold differently than everyone else's, then maybe you understand what I mean. Maybe you've sensed it too. That strange possibility that beneath all the uncertainty, something is quietly arranging itself. Not perfectly, not quickly, but but intentionally. And for the first time, I began wondering if that intention had a face, a heart, a story. A woman who was unknowingly learning the same lessons under a different sky. A woman who might one day understand why none of it was random. A woman who might be listening right now. There was a time when I thought understanding destiny would make loneliness easier. I was wrong. If anything, it made it more complicated. Because once I started believing my life was being guided, another question appeared, a difficult one. If I was being guided, then guided toward what or toward whom? And that question stayed with me. Not every day, not constantly, but often enough that I couldn't ignore it, especially during the quieter seasons, especially when success stopped distracting me. People rarely talk about this part. They talk about finding purpose, finding meaning, finding direction. But very few talk about what happens when you begin sensing a direction without yet seeing the destination. That's where I found myself, moving forward, growing, learning, yet still carrying an emptiness I couldn't explain. One winter evening, I drove for hours without any real destination. The roads were mostly empty. Streetlights stretched into the distance. It's like small pools of gold. The radio was off. The heater hummed softly. Outside, the world felt suspended, as though everything had paused. I remember stopping at a quiet overlook outside the city. Nothing remarkable about the place, just darkness. Cold air. Distant lights scattered across the horizon. Yet standing there, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. The kind that arrives when life stops demanding answers. The kind that arrives when you finally stop demanding them too. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, breathing in the cold night air, and a strange memory surfaced. Not a major memory, something small. Years earlier, I had been involved in a near accident. Nothing catastrophic. Just one of those moments where events unfold a second differently and everything changes. A car crossed unexpectedly, brakes, screamed, my heart pounded. Then silence. Afterward, I sat there shaking. Not because of what happened, because of what almost happened. And for days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about how thin the line can be, how entire futures sometimes depend on seconds. Seconds, that's all. One decision, one delay, one unexpected interruption, and everything changes. Standing beneath that winter sky years later, I realized how many moments in my life had been like that. Moments where something pulled me back, moments where plans changed unexpectedly. Moments where circumstances intervened before I could move further down a certain road. At first, I called those moments frustrating. Now I wasn't so sure, because every road I didn't take eventually revealed something. A lesson, a redirection, a protection, a truth. The pattern was impossible to ignore. And yet, despite all those realizations, there remained one ache I couldn't solve. The ache of not knowing who I was becoming all this for. That is the part nobody prepares you for. Success can answer many questions. It cannot answer that one. Achievement can fill calendars. Achievement can fill calendars. It cannot fill certain silences. There are some rooms in the human heart that only connection can reach. I spent years pretending otherwise, years convincing myself I was fine, years believing independence was enough, until eventually I admitted the truth. Independence is valuable, but it is not the same thing as companionship. Strength is valuable, but it is not the same thing as being known. Accomplishment is valuable, but it is not the same thing as having someone who understands the journey behind it. That realization arrived slowly. Then, all at once, like dawn, you don't notice it changing the sky until suddenly everything looks different. That was the turning point. The moment I stopped seeing loneliness as evidence that something was wrong and started seeing it as evidence that something mattered, because loneliness is often love with nowhere to go, care with nowhere to land, presence with no one beside it. I know that may sound strange, but it felt true. And once I saw it that way, I began viewing my own story differently. Not as a man waiting, as a man preparing. The difference changed everything. Preparing requires trust. Waiting often feels passive. Preparing feels purposeful. And for the first time, I wondered whether someone else was preparing too. Someone living her own life, facing her own disappointments, questioning her own timing, perhaps standing in front of her own window late at night asking many of the same questions, perhaps wondering if she had missed something, perhaps wondering if love had forgotten her. I don't know why that thought affected me so deeply. Maybe because it made the world feel smaller. Maybe because it transformed loneliness into connection. Or maybe because somewhere inside me, I had begun sensing something I couldn't yet explain. The feeling that my story was no longer unfolding in isolation. The feeling that another story existed somewhere beyond my sight, running parallel to mine, learning different lessons, experiencing different detours, yet somehow moving in the same direction. I didn't have evidence for that, only intuition. And intuition is difficult to defend, but it becomes harder to dismiss when it keeps returning. Mine kept returning again and again, especially during moments of strange peace. That's another thing I noticed. The closer I came to accepting uncertainty, the more peace appeared. Not certainty, peace. There's a difference. Certainty says, I know what's coming. Peace says, I don't know what's coming, but I'm no longer afraid of it. That peace changed me, because once fear loosened its grip, hope found room to breathe. And hope began showing me possibilities I couldn't see before. Possibilities involving timing. Possibilities involving love. Possibilities involving a woman I had never met and yet somehow felt connected to, not through memory, through anticipation, as if destiny wasn't asking me to look backward anymore, as if it was quietly asking me to look ahead, toward someone, toward something, toward a meeting neither of us could yet see. And somehow, standing there beneath that cold winter sky, I began believing that maybe the years hadn't been separating us. Maybe they had been aligning us.